You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host from New York City, Ankit Panda, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Abhigyan Reg, the Diplomats security and defense editor, who's joining me from New Delhi. Abhi, how are you today?
I'm great. Thank you, Ankit.
It's terrific to be back, and as listeners will expect, we are still continuing our post-U.S. elections coverage. And yes, I mean, still more than 3 weeks after the elections, we still don't have a concession from outgoing President Donald Trump, but Joe Biden is president-elect of the United States still. And today we'll be talking a little bit about the implications of the incoming Biden administration for U.S. policy in South Asia. So we'll talk mostly about the U.S. relationship with India, mostly due to scoping reasons, not out of any particular editorial decision, given that India is the largest country in the region and tends to be the most important relationship for the United States. But I do also want to talk a little bit about the broader U.S. presence in the Indian Ocean region, U.S. attempts to balance China around South Asia with countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, which has also recently received attention from the Trump administration. Also talk a little bit about Pakistan if we have time. So it's a packed agenda. It's a busy region. So Abhi, just to cut to the chase a little bit, let's start by talking about India. So you're based in New Delhi. What have you been seeing around town in terms of the reaction to Joe Biden's victory? Obviously, just a little over a year ago, we saw President Trump and Prime Minister Modi, celebrated here in the United States with the Howdy Modi event, in which the Indian Prime Minister memorably repeated Donald Trump's campaign slogan in a way that was interpreted by many folks as an effective endorsement of sorts, which was a little puzzling given the generally you have seen Indian prime ministers stay out of American domestic politics. But what have you seen around town? What's the reaction been to the incoming Biden administration?
I think, Ankit, what is going on here is that you have a two-tiered reaction. So you have, as usual, reaction from government of India, the BJP-led Narendra Modi government. But you also have simultaneously reaction from BJP voices, who necessarily may not be directly part of the Bharatiya Janata Party, but are widely seen in this town and I suspect also abroad as being very sympathetic or very close to Mr. Modi. So to unpack these two, obviously when it comes to the establishment and the establishment's voices, it's very simple. They're saying, we have worked with Barack Obama, we know Joe Biden, there are structural reasons, and all of these simultaneously means that no matter who's in Washington, it is not going to matter for US-India ties. Now, this is conventional wisdom. You and I both have read a lot of op-eds around it on making this argument. Now, let's go back to the other side. As I said, it's a two-track, in many ways, two-track signaling, two-track voicing of concerns or whatever you want to call it. So when you look at these BJP voices, who are or voices close to the Bharatiya Janata Party, rather, you see almost a I wouldn't call it fear, but I would say apprehension, certainly. And I'll tell you why I'm thinking that this is the case. If you look at the first few days after November 3rd, or even in the run-up to November 3rd, or November 3rd itself, you had very prominent BJP-linked voices on social media voicing support for Trump. In fact, repeating some of Trump's patently false claims around voter fraud, around some kind of nebulous conspiracy that Trump has been going around town suggesting. So you see that signaling from some very prominent people saying, "Oh, this is Trump was a disruptor." And now, all the establishment guys are back, all these Ivy League types, East Coast types, whatever, New Yorkers, so they're all back, right? So that suggests to me a degree of dissonance between the official line, which is that all is well, and the quasi-official line, which says perhaps not everything is going to be hunky-dory come January 20th.
Yeah. I mean, no, that's, let's dig into that a little more. I think the place to begin is, first of all, even under Trump, U.S.-India ties had their fair share of bumps in the road, right? And this has been the story. I mean, as you repeated the conventional wisdom, everybody writing an op-ed on U.S.-India relations points out that the trajectory in this relationship for the last 20 years has been, a positive coefficient. The relationship is heading upwards and continues to advance, given that strong strategic logic. Some people point to the shared values between the two countries, values that I think are going to be a little bit more of a sticking point under Biden. But under Trump, you had your fair share of bumps in the road, including trade policy, the removal of India from the GSP status. You had bumps in the road over U.S. Afghanistan policy, U.S. Iran policy. Even U.S. Pakistan policy early on, at least, and that sort
U.S.
of
Russia policy.
yeah, and U.S. Russia
U.S.
policy,
Russia policy.
CATSA and sanctions. So bumps in the road have always been there. But now, as you pointed out, one of India perhaps was one of the few countries in the region. I mean, not a formal ally, but a U.S. partner that benefited from the Trump administration's sort of amoral transactionalism in foreign policy, right? In some ways, that because of the Trump administration's interest in balancing China and pursuing a free and open Indo-Pacific, there was that logic that has brought the U.S. and India together over years. I think manifested in ways that I think New Delhi didn't quite mind under Trump, and under Biden. While I think much of that logic will remain, there is, I think, this concern in New Delhi that there will be more uncomfortable conversations over particularly internal issues in India. Tony Blinken, former Deputy Secretary of State and nominee for Secretary of State in the Biden administration, delivered remarks at an event at the Hudson Institute this summer where he very pointedly, I think, made direct reference to the Citizenship Amendment Act in India. The Biden campaign website commented on human rights in Kashmir. So there have been, I think, concerns that there will have to be uncomfortable conversations, and I don't think there's particularly a lot of interest in New Delhi in having those conversations. Right, there is a preference to keep this relationship on the path of strategic transactionalism in some ways, and continue to advance things. So let me posit sort of my hypothesis on what I think will happen here. I think even as you will have a Democratic administration that will, at least nominally and rhetorically, place much more of an emphasis on values-based engagement with India and other countries, I think at the end of the day, the conventional wisdom might actually be right here, and that we will continue to see the U.S.-India relationship continue to do fairly well, even if there are bumps in the road. You'll occasionally probably have, a BJP minister here and a Democratic congressperson here, say something that reveals an uncomfortable truth, perhaps. But ultimately, I think at the executive level, things will continue. Am I wrong about that? Do you have a different assessment, or?
Okay. So one of the arguments I've been making, and I think the first time I made this argument was in a national interest piece I wrote in April or May 2016, months before Trump was elected president. And I repeated this argument on November 3rd, literally, which is that perhaps the biggest benefit that the Modi government has received from the Trump presidency is not all the military agreements, whether that is Comcasa or Becca, or even perhaps more enthusiastic American ideation around selling advanced weaponry to India, but rather it's different, right? What has happened is a United States that is inward-looking or plainly chaotic opened a certain strategic space for India to manage certain perceived problems. So if you look at 2016, to my mind, it was significant for two reasons, right? It was, okay, of course, Trump's election in November, but beyond that was the fact that that is the year when the insurgency in Kashmir really flares up, right? I mean, you have the killing of Burhan Wani that summer, which leads to a massive crackdown and massive flare-up. And so you already saw prominent Indian voices, some of them have since joined the government, saying that, look, nobody cares if this is the structural circumstances of the planet. You had Brexit, you had almost the US elections. You could see some turbulence building up to the election. So under those circumstances, India could do certain things that normally India would not be able to do. And you saw that vividly last year, right? You
Hmm.
saw that with 370, with the Citizenship Amendment Act, uh, more dramatically in February this year when Donald Trump was in town and literally kilometers away there was a Hindu Muslim riot going on. I submit to you that the biggest benefit that the Modi government has received is that space to take decisions it would have normally not been able to take had Hillary Clinton been the president. So, just to extend this argument a little bit ahead into the Biden administration, I agree with you. Structural logic will dictate a certain stability, upward trajectory to the US India relationship. But what I fear is that the window to take fairly dramatic action has closed for New Delhi
Right.
since the GS's announcement that the transition will begin.
Yeah, no, I think you make a very important point. I mean, the only thing, I would say that the permissive conditions that not only India, I mean, so many countries, including the Philippines, states in the Middle East, even a certain illiberal European states. There's just been a permissive environment where the United States hasn't been particularly interested in talking to anybody about values, and states have opportunistically seized on that. I mean, in India, I would also point to the 2019 general election mandate, I think, had something to do with the actions that were then taken with regard to Kashmir and the
Sure.
Citizenship Amendment Act and a few issues there. So it's not a monocausal thing, but I agree that it does factor into it. I mean, if we do see, I think, in 2016, especially that transition from phase one of Modi, when you have op-eds abroad writing about how Modi is going to bring the Gujarat
Sure.
economic model to India and really supercharge India's economy. And actually, I think it was the day of the U.S. election in 2016 when Modi announced his demonetization decision. And that was sort of the beginning
That's
of
right.
the flashy move first, think later kind of approach in India with regard to not only demonetization but so many other issues. So you sort of see the second phase begin, where the BJP is just much more of a risk-taking party, but not a risk taker in the way that sort of the Financial Times op-ed page might like, right? More risk-taking in the way that I think the party itself wanted to do these things for so long, and sort of seized on it. So I think, we will, I might be wrong here. We might actually be in for a much rockier time just in terms of a values-based engagement. I mean, let's also keep in mind that we had several incidents during the Trump years of certain Indian officials having a rather bumpy relationship, not only with Democratic members of Congress here in the United States, but also certain members that may end up serving in a Biden administration. So we're still
That's
waiting to find out the personalities that will really be at play in South Asia. But I think even as we acknowledge the role of structural factors, it's perhaps best not to be complacent about a smooth sailing ahead. But let's move on a little because we have a lot of ground to cover, not a lot of time, unfortunately. Let's talk a little bit about the situation over the border, primarily in Pakistan, but also a little bit about Afghanistan as well, right? I mean, we're looking at the Trump administration now leaving the United States or leaving Biden with a very different posture in Afghanistan, a significant reduction in troops. So that, I think, is something that will be an important change to the strategic environment in South Asia. But also, I think, what's your sense of the relationship with Pakistan? I mean, under Trump, there had been obviously, I think, early on signs that the relationship with Pakistan wouldn't quite take the sort of hits. I mean, I remember very vividly Trump's the readout when Trump was president-elect that came out of the Pakistani PMO with Nawaz Sharif at the helm at the time, that was just gushing about the state of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, and obviously things took a turn for the worse later with cuts to foreign assistance and greater scrutiny of Pakistani state support for terrorism. So with Biden incoming, what's your expectation for the U.S.-Pakistan relationship?
so. See, one of the things that you saw when Obama came in, right, for the first time, was the sense that Pakistan is an actor. Yes, it's a malign actor, perhaps sometimes, but it's a necessary partner or necessary whatever you want to call it, right? Um, and so we need to work with Pakistan. I mean, you saw Obama, right? Very, very early Obama first term, you had this interest that Pakistan is an actor you could work with. obviously that doesn't pan out, right? And one of the reasons are the drone strikes, is Obama's drone program, but it's not the only reason. I mean, of course, Pakistan didn't help matters, as you very well know. I think what's going to happen now is going to be driven by two things, right? The first factor is what happens in Pakistan, inside Pakistan. Because I have been, as you might know, I write very frequently on Pakistan, perhaps more than I write about India. But just following the trajectory of everything that has happened with the opposition movement, Imran Khan's, rise and fall and rise and question mark kind of thing that we're seeing. So there is a lot of uncertainty about what happens inside Pakistan itself, right? So one of the things why that is important is that if, for example, the Pakistan military, which is, as you know very well, the ultimate arbiter of who actually sits in power in Islamabad. I mean, you can talk about elections, so on and so forth. It really does not matter, right? So if they decide to jettison Khan and then bring in, I would suspect if Khan was to jettison and bring in somebody like Bilawal Bhutto. Now think about Bilawal Bhutto's relationship with the West, right? I mean, Bilawal Bhutto, as the son of Benazir, would be seen much more favorably, I would suspect, in Western capitals. So that might actually provide an opening for the Pakistan military to kind of hit the reset button, reach out to the Biden administration. Of course, this is part one of the story. The more important, I would submit, part of the story is what happens with Afghanistan, right? Because as we know, there's not going to be a ceasefire. I mean, the talks are going nowhere, literally, right. And if you stick to the commitments that the Trump administration has set, what is it like? There would be 2,000 troops left come January 20th. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 2,500. Yeah. So if that is effective, it seems that is going to be the case. It's going to be very hard, as you know, for Biden to send troops back in. I mean, there's not going to be any domestic support in the United States for that. So, which gives Pakistan a very powerful card, right, about the future of Afghanistan. And the card that they've played since, I don't know, the early days of Tora Bora. I mean, in October 2001, November 2001. That's the card they've played. They'll continue to play that card. So, I think two things. What happens inside Pakistan? Does the military jettison Khan for somebody more palatable, for the lack of a better phrase, like Bilawal Zardari Bhutto? And also what happens with Afghanistan. I think these two things. I'm not so much concerned about Biden trying to, get in and mediate, something Mr. Trump, for example, tried to do quite unsuccessfully on a couple of occasions, about mediating between India and Pakistan. I don't think Kashmir is going to be the dynamics that's going to set the tone for the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, because Kashmir is a no-go for India when it comes to the United States, and I don't think, as you said, because of these structural reasons, that's not going to happen. So it's domestic politics in Pakistan plus what happens in Afghanistan. I think that sets the trajectory for Pakistan, U.S. under Biden.
Well, I mean, not to go back to India too much, but I think this past year has been a reminder for many in the United States that, and frankly, it's a reminder that shouldn't be necessary, that India's primary threat environment is land-based, right? It's in Kashmir, it's in the north, it's along the Himalayan border, not only with Pakistan but also with China. And I think, in a way, I think under Biden there will be that interest to continue to emphasize to New Delhi that where India really plays the more important role for the United States is in that maritime space. But of course, if you look at Indian defense spending, that the maritime theater, even if India says things about a free and open Indo-Pacific, it is still very much a land-based military.
That's right.
So by what I'm getting to here is that I think if Biden does want to draw India more into the IOR and even, let's say, the Western Pacific, South China Sea, et cetera, there will be an interest, I think, to try and reduce Indian insecurity along the border, and that might bear on the way in which the Biden team thinks about at least the export of terror from Pakistan. And I think we will be going into Biden's inauguration in the first few months of 2021, at least, with the situation in Eastern Ladakh continuing to simmer as it has. Let's not open that can of worms on this podcast. We can come back to that later. But yeah, no, I think you set us up nicely in terms of the the issues that will come to bear in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But let's move a little bit to talk about the Indian Ocean region, right? So this has been, I think, one of the themes, just in terms of how the United States thinks about Asia over the last 4 years. One of the advancements under the Trump administration has been just a much more prominent role for the Indian Ocean region, right? We can go back to symbolic gestures like renaming Pacific Command, Indo-Pacific Command. There are still some geographic, I think, there's some geographic uncomfortableness with
Sure.
the way in which the region is conceived of, right? You have Indo-PACOM's area of responsibility, for instance, doesn't actually cover the entire Indian Ocean region. It sort of ends at the longitudinal border
Yep.
that where Gujarat meets Sindh, right? So
Sure.
the Western IOR and the Eastern IOR are sort of two separate things in the American imagination. But broader point being that the Indian Ocean is just seen as a much more important part of the world for the United States in a way that it never really was. During the Cold War, or even in the post-Cold War years, for that instance. So, thinking about this region, it seems pretty clear to me that I think the Biden team will maintain this part of the Trump administration's geopolitical thinking about Asia. And I guess a big component here will be sort of economic competition with China, right? I mean, China has been, going back to, I think, 2015 was when Xi Jinping did his Indian Ocean tour, when he stopped by the Maldives and Sri Lanka. So how do you think?
Pakistan.
How do you think the Biden folks will really think about the IOR in the coming years?
What the thing is, I mean, even if you look at the IOR region, right, you do not see a single position that these smaller states take when it comes to the United States, right? And I think the best way to see it is how differently the Maldives under Ibrahim Solih and Sri Lanka under Gotabaya Rajapaksa, how they're approaching the United States, how they're approaching India. And I think that's very, very illustrative, because literally, the Maldives and Sri Lanka is just next to each other for all practical purposes. And they're very close, both rather close to India. So you see the difference, right? So when you look at Sri Lanka, you clearly see the way the Sri Lankans snubbed Pompeo during his visit. They're very clear about where the United States stands, which is, I think the Sri Lankan foreign minister said something like, yes, the US is a great friend of ours, but, we welcome everybody because we have a, whatever philosophy of non-alignment, or whatever they termed it as. So you see that. But you see Solih, on the other hand, welcoming the United States. I mean, and Pompeo's reception in Malé and Colombo, I mean, it told you the story of how the United States is seen. Now, just because there is a Biden administration, that's not going to change, because the guys running Colombo, the guys running Malé, are going to remain the same till their next election, which is going to be like halfway through Biden's first term. So you see that going on. Now, when it comes to these countries, what are their, you just kind of unpack what is it that they want, right? So one of the things that Sri Lanka, for example, Gotabaya has kept on saying, I mean, he's a little chastened, I think, after everything that happened, but he keeps on saying that we need economic aid. We need to build our infrastructure. But at the same time, you have the same guy or his colleagues, his ministers, have refused to take money from the United States under the MCC. So MCC, the Trump administration tried to push MCC like anything. It didn't happen in Sri Lanka. It didn't happen in Nepal. Though I'm told that in Nepal, the story is a little bit more complicated. Mm-hmm. So to what extent do you make American power palatable in these smaller countries is going to be the challenge for the Biden administration, because the obvious tactics have not worked, right? Yes, for security, I think these smaller countries would want both India and China to be present in the region, frankly. This kind of balances each other out, perhaps also the US. But beyond that, I think the problems you saw with the Trump administration is going to persist with the Biden administration.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very nuanced answer, and I think it's accurate. I think the Biden folks will. I think they're probably coming in with a better understanding of the fact. I mean, frankly, the Chinese didn't know this a few years ago, I think, or at least didn't have a good sense for how domestic politics would, I think, play a role. I mean, in approaching. I mean, not only these smaller countries in South Asia, but I mean, much of this I think was the story in Southeast Asia, and Sebastian and I talked about this on the most recent podcast we did, which is that. Ultimately, I mean, we can talk about, the Maldives and Sri Lanka as these entities, these black boxes with never-changing interests. But the fact of the matter is that domestic
No,
political changes. I mean, the change from Sirisena to Gotabaya Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka has been a significant source of not only internal change, but also external change in how Sri Lanka positions itself, and more dramatically in the Maldives. I mean, especially with regard to the relationship with India, the historic relationship with India. It's been much more recalibrated back to the mean, so to speak, with Soli at the helm. And also, I mean, these states will, I think, look to be wined and dined by India, China, and the United States. I mean, why not, right? I mean, you can get the most out of everybody as they look to compete.
There will be a non-alignment.
Exactly. And there's a very practical reason for it, which is that it'll just bring in generally more investment. I mean, I think one of the big differences, though, is that, you won't have that Mike Pompeo approach of, you're either with us or you're against us. I think the Biden team will be a little bit more open to working with certain countries that might have a closer relationship with China, frankly, than the United States. And I think that might manifest in positive ways for the United States, at least in terms of, actually competing with China. But certainly, I think that's that's been an important component of U.S. outreach to the region. And also just in terms of the Biden team's interest in de-emphasizing the military more generally and emphasizing diplomatic tools, I think this will be something to watch in the coming years. So we're coming to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask you, I mean, when it comes to the incoming administration and South Asia, is there anything major you think we left out?
No, I don't think we did. I think I would also. I mean, I briefly touched on Nepal. I think Nepal would be very interesting because of similar reasons, I would say, as in Pakistan, because Nepal is also going through considerable turmoil internally because there is no. I mean, one frankly does not know what's going on in Nepal because you have the Oli Dahal competition sort of intensifying. The party is very close. NCP is very close to splitting right now. You have frantic diplomatic activity right now in Kathmandu. So I think Wai-Fang Che was in Nepal, is supposed to be in Nepal one of these days, right? Or I think he was already there. But anyway, the week before, just last week, you had the Indian Foreign Secretary. Before that, you had the Indian Army Chief, and right before that, very strangely enough, a very public trip by the Chief of the Research and Analysis Wing, India's principal external intelligence service, Samant Goel, was also there. So Nepal, there was a lot of turmoil, right? So how does that turmoil, plus Biden administration, how does that interact? I think I'd be very interested in seeing how that, because Nepal is quickly emerging as, I would say, as a frontline state. If you wish to describe this as a quote unquote new Cold War, a phrase I do not like at all, but so sort of this intense strategic competition, if that continues till Biden into the Biden administration, as we all expect, Nepal becomes very important. So I think that
Right.
would be one thing that I would also keep an eye on, other than India, Pakistan, and the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, no, not to write off Nepal at all. I mean, it's been something that I've been particularly interested in when I was writing about these issues more. I mean, it's really, I mean, it's the story. I guess at this point, it's the story of more than a half decade of drift, right? Going back to the September 2015 promulgation of Nepal's constitution and the Indian reaction thereof, and then a few years down the line, fast forward, you have Nepali parliamentarians studying Xi Jinping thought. It's sort of a straight line between those two events in many ways. But yeah, I think Nepal's story is far from closed here. So I think we will continue to track that with interest. And then of course, we're looking at Bangladesh, which I think is the other prominent South Asian state we haven't talked about too much. I think there'll be continuing focus there. I think on the U.S. relationship, particularly on trade and manufacturing. I think there'll be a big focus there.
Human rights.
Human rights, yes, of course, the Rohingya, and I think that'll be a much better, much more prominent part of the agenda, generally diplomatically in South Asia. So I think we managed the impossible, covered most of the region in just under 30 minutes. But Abhi, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to come back on the show and to talk a little bit about what the Biden administration might mean for this very important region in the Asia Pacific. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
For listeners, if you've been a subscriber to the podcast but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate if you could do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. We'd love for you to keep up with future coverage on this podcast. Finally, before we close, a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.